Jeremy, we all set? Good to go? Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Lunch at the Library talk today. I know some folks are still on the lunch line. Please get this better? Okay, thank you. I'll take a Ricola for later, too. My name's Brian Carpenter. Welcome to the APS and our Lunch at the Library talk today. We're very glad to have you here. I'm the curator of Indigenous Materials here at the APS Library and Museum, and I run our Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. I'm very happy to welcome you here today, both those of you in person and for people joining us online. Excuse me. To begin, we would like to acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides here in Lenapehoking, which is the past, present, and ongoing homeland of the Lenape peoples. The Society also recognizes that it has benefited from being an occupant of this part of Lenape land now called Philadelphia. As an organization founded literally next to the seat of colonial power in Pennsylvania, that has many founders and leaders who were officials or even presidents for those colonial powers that expedited indigenous removal, the Society recognizes the importance of speaking about this history honestly and carrying itself forward now in a spirit of welcome and collaboration. So because of that, through our Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, the Society seeks to promote research that honors indigenous knowledge, cultivates scholarship, and strengthens languages and cultural traditions. And we express our sincere thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of many indigenous communities and individual people who have offered their guidance, expertise, and opportunities for collaboration that make all this work possible. So for those of you new to the APS, the American Philosophical Society is the oldest learned society in the United States, founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin for the purposes of promoting useful knowledge. That is the phrase you will see around the APS in many places. In the 21st century, we sustain this mission in three principal ways. We honor and engage leading scholars, scientists, and professionals through elected membership and opportunities for interdisciplinary intellectual fellowship, particularly in our semi-annual meetings, which are usually held here. We support research and discovery through grants and fellowships, lectures, publications, prizes, exhibitions, and public education. We serve scholars through a research library of manuscripts and other collections internationally recognized for their enduring historic value. And the APS's current activities reflect the founders' spirit of inquiry. They provide a forum for the free exchange of ideas and convey our conviction that intellectual inquiry and critical thought are inherently in the best interest of the public. A little bit about our Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. The APS Library holds one of the largest archives in North America of archival materials relating to indigenous peoples of North America and the languages, history, and continuing work. So it's very important to us to find opportunities to have talks that can highlight some of the research and work that's being done by that. If anyone here or online wants to be in touch, I have a brochure. I can't give you a brochure if you're on Zoom, but we have information on our website. We primarily, majority of our requests are from indigenous communities themselves, individual people, or from tribal entities like language programs, cultural centers, their own archives, et cetera. And we're very glad to be in touch with anyone wanting to engage with the collections in whatever way. So please do be in touch if you would like to learn more. Our speaker today is Nathan Sowry. He is the reference archivist at the Smithsonian Institution's National Museum of the American Indian, where he has worked since 2016. He regularly collaborates with Native and non-Native researchers, scholars, and community groups interested in utilizing archival collections and visiting their cultural heritage. Sowry received his bachelor's in anthropology and religious studies from the University of Pittsburgh, and a master's in history from Washington State University, go Cougars, an MLIS in Archives and Records Management from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and a PhD in History from American University. Before I hand it over to Nate, I'll just say, as an archivist, I am always pleased as punch when we can have talks by archivists, because I think they, in doing the work that he was described a bit in the bio there, are working especially with Native communities and researchers doing research in those types of collections that are at the Smithsonian and here and other places. One gets a perspective on the work that is unique and very useful. And the fact that he's also a historian and can pull all these researchers together in a great book and what will be a great talk, I think is very great for all of us. So please join me in welcoming Nate.
Welcome, everyone. Brian's a bit taller, so I'm going to bring this down a little bit. Everyone can hear me? Good? Okay. Just wanted to give a quick thank you. Sorry, I'm now at the age I need to put these on to read things. I wanted to give a quick thanks to Kathy Person and, of course, Brian Carpenter here at the American Philosophical Society for inviting me, and wanted to thank all of you for coming both in person and online. In person, I'm really shocked. There's a big gathering for a gloomy Thursday, so thank you for coming out. I'd like to begin by providing a vignette into the lives of one of these important but relatively unknown Native American anthropologists. Is that going to click it? That clicks it. All right, we're getting there. Before each performance, Florence Shotridge entered a small, temporarily vacant room in Philadelphia's University Museum. There, she would transform herself. She regularly shed the garments of many urban women of her day, replacing them with a buckskin Plains Indian-style dress. To this, she added moccasins, bracelets, and a necklace. Finally, she placed a headband with a single feather atop her head, complementing her long, straight, dark hair. When she was done, there was no sign of Florence's life in 1912 Philadelphia. Instead, she had transformed herself into something reminiscent of picturesque 1880s Lakota Sioux culture. With her costume complete, Florence greeted her audience of schoolchildren eager to learn about Native American histories and cultures. Marketed by the museum as a, quote, Indian princess, Florence embodied a stereotype of Native American life. She personified what many museum goers imagined indigenous life to be and what, quote, real Indians looked like. In appearance, she became a horse-riding, feather headdress-wearing, teepee-inhabiting woman of the Great Plains. In this, she mirrored many Native people who performed in Buffalo Bill's popular Wild West shows. Although none of the schoolchildren in Philadelphia's University Museum would have noticed, the glass beads Florence habitually wore around her neck belied her supposed Plains Indian heritage. This necklace was of Russian manufacture and an heirloom passed down to Florence from her Tlingit grandmother. Rather than being a modern Minnehaha or an Indian princess of the American Great Plains, as the newspapers reported, Florence in reality came from much further west than many in her audience ever imagined. In the photograph seen here, the image on the left is of Florence taken in 1900 when she was approximately 17 years old living in Alaska. The image on the right was taken a dozen years later and portrays Florence as Philadelphia Museum audiences would have seen her. Florence was born in approximately 1882 or 1883 in Chilkoot in the Alaska Territory. In the historical record, she is known by many names, including Mary Dennis, Susie Skundu, Florence Dennis, Katwaxne, and Katkawaxne. She was the daughter of the powerful and respected Tlingit healer Skundu. After great persistence, Skundu, along with other Tlingit leaders, eventually permitted Presbyterian missionaries led by S. Hull Young to settle in the Klukwan-Haines area in the late 19th century. There, the missionaries quickly built schools to disseminate their Christian beliefs. Photographs in the middle and on the right of the screen depict Florence's father Skundu, missionary S. Hull Young, and the village of Klukwan in 1895. Florence was one of many Alaska Native schoolchildren to attend the Presbyterian Mission School in Haines, seen here in the photograph on the left. She would ultimately spend 4 years there under missionary tutelage. Like other survivors of mission and Indian boarding schools, Florence's schooling was full of racist declarations about the backwardness of her history, language, and culture. Fortunately for her, Florence also had the good fortune to receive instruction outside of the school walls. From her female relatives, she learned beadwork, basket weaving, and chilkat blanket weaving. On the screen are photographs of blanket weaving and one of the chilkat robes woven by Florence. In 1902, Florence married fellow Chilkat Tlingit community member and Indian boarding school survivor Florence Shotridge. He is seen here in the image on the lower right. The two would spend the next 15 years side by side. During that time, they traveled across the country repeatedly, mingled in anthropological circles, and worked in Indian fairs. They also sang on vaudeville stages, lectured to museum audiences, and even conducted the first Native-led anthropological expedition to Alaska. Opportunities for indigenous peoples on and off of reservations were rare. As we will see, Florence and Lewis did what they could to teach others about their culture. They accomplished this despite often being relegated to stereotypes of how non-native audiences expected, quote, real Indians to look. Florence and Lewis caught the traveling bug within a year of their marriage. In 1903, by happy coincidence, Alaska's territorial governor visited the Klukwan-Haines area. After seeing Florence's weaving skills, the governor invited her to attend the upcoming 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, or World's Fair, in Portland, Oregon. There she would demonstrate her art as well as showcase her Tlingit culture to fairgoers. The 23-year-old Florence jumped at this opportunity, and her young husband Lewis eagerly agreed to accompany her. Recognizing the public's desire for native-made objects, the ever-savvy Lewis brought with him several dozen items of Tlingit manufacture for sale. One of his customers ended up being George Byron Gordon of Philadelphia's University Museum, who was in Portland on a collecting trip. Gordon is pictured in the image above, sporting some dapper and pointy facial hair. Florence, Lewis, and Gordon quickly became friends. This would eventually pay off because years later, Gordon would play a major role in the anthropology careers of this young couple. Another individual Florence and Lewis met at the 1905 World's Fair would also play a big part in their future careers. This was the duplicitous Antonio Apache, seen in the photograph on the right. In 1906, Antonio Apache opened his Indian Crafts Exposition in what is now Lincoln Park in Los Angeles, California. Apache gathered native basket makers, blanket weavers, silversmiths, artists, and canoe builders into a self-supporting anthropological village where they would live and work. This was similar to many Indian villages constructed at World's Fairs across the nation at this time. In these manufactured villages, non-native visitors would watch indigenous people make their wares and could purchase the finished products for a small fee. The proceeds from these sales were the livelihood of the native artists, as well as for Apache as the manager of the Indian Crafts Exposition. Newspapers proclaimed it one of the most interesting and expansive ethnological displays in the country, rivaling anthropology museums in the Midwest and East Coast. At Antonio Apache's invitation, Florence and Lewis ended up working and living there for the bulk of the exposition's existence from 1906 until 1911. The image on the left-hand side is from the 1910 federal census. The inset detail lists Antonio Apache and the Shotridges as employees of the Indian Crafts Exposition living in the Indian Village in Los Angeles. Of course, it was also during these years that Antonio Apache's supposed native heritage came into question. Newspapers across the country reported in 1907 that Antonio Apache was not a member of the White Mountain Apache community from Arizona, as he claimed. Instead, many argued that Apache was in fact a Louisiana-born black man by the name of Tony Simpson. While Apache claimed until his dying breath that he was indeed native, everything today points to the man being an imposter. He used his appropriated cultural identity for financial and professional advantage while excluding qualified indigenous peoples from anthropological opportunities. While the photograph on the right shows Antonio Apache in typical Euro-American clothing, the center photo portrays him as he was more often seen by audiences. Here he appears making, quote, authentic jewelry from his purported southwestern homeland. No evidence exists to suggest Florence and Lewis knew Apache's true identity. While their ultimate reason for leaving remains unclear, we know that in 1911, the Shotridges packed up and left Apache's Indian Crafts Exposition in Los Angeles. Now, what have I done? Soon after leaving, Florence and Lewis joined the cast of a popular native theater company managed by a woman known in the media as Mademoiselle Tuna. Her real name was Matilda Coots Johnston, and her specialty as a manager was selecting and training native entertainers to sing grand opera in the original French, German, and Italian languages. This she combined with popular Native American dances and songs for the audience's enjoyment. She can be seen in the postcard image here, flanked by Florence and Lewis, along with other members of the opera company. Mademoiselle Tuna arranged for the Shotridges to take music and English lessons during their time with her theater troupe. Additionally, they and the other native performers wore Plains Indian clothing while on stage, meeting audience expectations of how real Indians should look. The shows were a wild success, with the Indian Grand Opera Company traveling from city to city back and forth across the country. Despite receiving much acclaim in the theater arena, Florence and Lewis's association with Mademoiselle Tuna did not last long. They still wanted to make a move into serious anthropology work to preserve the beauty and richness of their culture. Fortunately for them, their old friend George Byron Gordon had some positions waiting for them at Philadelphia's University Museum. As noted previously, the Shotridges met Gordon years earlier at the 1905 Portland World's Fair when he was doing collecting work there. Since that time, Gordon had risen through the ranks of the Philadelphia Museum, eventually becoming its director in 1911. Having maintained his connection with Florence and Lewis, Gordon invited them to become a part of his staff. Particularly popular in those days at the museum were lectures geared towards children. When possible, these presentations were led by Native museum employees. Regardless of their heritage and geographic region, these indigenous staff members would dress in Plains Indian clothing to appeal to school classes visiting the museum. Often labeled princesses and chiefs, these Native women and men danced, sang songs, and spoke about indigenous cultures and lifeways. Florence and Lewis quickly took on these roles. Displayed here are images of museum visitors admiring an exhibition and a museum clipping lauding the Shotridges' work in the museum. On the right, Lewis and Florence are seen surrounded by school children. While the museum conferred upon Lewis the title of curatorial assistant, Florence, being a woman and an indigenous woman at that, became instead an Indian princess. This, despite the fact that she possessed the same qualifications as her husband. Although we don't know Florence's thoughts about this type of work, we know she wowed museum audiences. She built on earlier performances with Antonio Apache's Indian Village and Mademoiselle Tuna's Indian Grand Opera Company. Florence once again reprised her role as an Indian princess dressed in Plains Indian clothing, and audiences loved it. A reporter from the Philadelphia Inquirer described her in a 1912 newspaper article as, quote, a real Indian, clad in buckskin and beads. Note the center photograph of Florence and Lewis in stereotyped clothing. Nor was Florence alone in being pigeonholed into the role of an Indian princess. Numerous other Native women of this era found employment on stage and in museums depicting caricatures of Native American life. 3 of Florence's contemporaries worked at New York's American Museum of Natural History at the same time. These women included Princess Watawasso, also known as Lucy Nicolar, a Penobscot woman, Princess Chinquilla, also known as Mary Newell, a Southern Cheyenne woman, and Princess Teata, also known as Mary Frances Thompson, a Chickasaw woman. Despite their varied cultural backgrounds, each of them dressed in Plains Indian clothing, performed songs and dances for audiences, and were dubbed Indian princesses. Seen here are museum booklets from the 1920s in New York listing some of their upcoming performances. These women all shared something else in common, though. They each used their celebrity status to speak out about injustice in Indian country and to advocate for Native American sovereignty. Lucy Nicolar pushed for Penobscot voting rights in her home state of Maine. In New York, Mary Newell organized an aid society for American Indians living in the city. And more broadly, after her days as an Indian princess, Mary Frances Thompson later toured the world championing Native American cultures on a global scale. But Florence and Lewis weren't known only for their performances in Plains Indian clothing at the Philadelphia Museum. They did much more than dress up as stereotyped real Indians. Largely unprecedented for Native museum employees, they interpreted, arranged, and described Northwest Coast collections. They even created miniature models of Tlingit villages for exhibition, one of which is pictured here. In addition to lecturing and creating exhibits, they also published about their culture, including articles they wrote for the museum's scholarly journal. The article on the left is titled Indians of the Northwest, written by Florence and Lewis. On the right is Florence's solo article titled The Life of a Chilkat Indian Girl. Both articles were published by the Philadelphia Museum in 1913. During these days, they befriended a number of leading non-native anthropologists. In addition to George Byron Gordon at the Philadelphia Museum, they worked closely with Mark Raymond Harrington, Alanson Skinner, and Frank Speck. In 1914 and 1915, Florence and Lewis even lived briefly in New York, taking up temporary quarters on West 121st Street near Columbia University. There they worked with Franz Boas on linguistics, eventually producing a Tlingit grammar of their language. A photograph of Franz Boas, later dubbed the father of American anthropology, is in the center of the screen. Just as a side note, his papers are here at the American Philosophical Society in the archives, so they were very helpful to my research. On the right are images of the collaborative grammar he and the Shotridges co-wrote. As we've seen, Florence and Lewis were very involved in museum and anthropology work. Their next step, the one they had been waiting for, was to conduct ethnographic fieldwork in Alaska among their own community. They hoped to study their culture through their own eyes, and they wanted to explain their culture through their own voices. As Native anthropologists under the aegis of the Philadelphia Museum, they would be able to portray their community themselves, rather than their history and life ways being interpreted by outsiders. In June 1915, Florence and Lewis led a collecting expedition on behalf of Philadelphia's University Museum to the Northwest Coast and Alaska. As they were the first Native-led wife and husband anthropological expedition, their work was wholly unprecedented. Once again, newspaper reporters scrambled to tell their story. Numerous news stories about the, quote, civilized Indians who explored the wilds of Alaska popped up in the press. One such newspaper clipping can be seen here on the left, juxtaposed with a 21st century photograph of Chilkoot Lake in Alaska. From their home base in the village of Haines, Alaska, Florence and Lewis spent the next 2 years attending potlatches, writing observations, and recording Tlingit songs on wax cylinders with a phonograph machine. They also wrote down the songs and beliefs of their people, while simultaneously acquiring countless Northwest Coast objects and material culture belongings that they shipped to the Philadelphia Museum. Note the center photograph of the house where the Shotridges lived in Haines. On the right are genealogical and linguistic notes they collected. Sadly, their collaborative fieldwork ended abruptly in June 1917. Florence had been sick since the previous summer, but things had gotten progressively worse in recent months. Despite what comfort and aid Lewis and her community members could offer, Florence passed away on June 12, 1917, from tuberculosis. She spent her last moments surrounded by friends and family in her native land. 3 days later, Florence was buried in a cemetery along Chilcoot Lake, not far from where she and Lewis first attended school together at the Presbyterian Mission in Haines. For 12 years, the two had crisscrossed the country, performing as entertainers and working as anthropologists. And now it had all come to a sudden end. Florence had just started her most rewarding work when she died in 1917 at age 35. Correspondence between Lewis and Philadelphia Museum staff regarding her death are included here, along with a newspaper clipping lamenting her passing. Jobs for Native women in the early days of U.S. anthropology were often few, far between, and socially constrained by gender. Despite being relegated to overlooked collaborators and Indian princesses, a handful of Native women successfully fought to escape these confining roles. Women such as Ella Cara Deloria, Gladys Tantaquidgeon, and Florence Shotridge broke down the barriers before them and created new spaces as anthropologists in their own right. We don't know what else Florence may have accomplished had she not died so young. No doubt she would have created a more permanent place for herself and other Native women within museum anthropology. Inevitably, Florence would have continued to educate people about the diversity, beauty, and rich histories of the indigenous nations of North America. Finally, if she had lived longer, perhaps she also would have tempered her husband's questionable collecting practices that later earned him the antipathy of his people. Of course, due to time constraints, we can't really get into Lewis's collecting here, but for anyone interested, you can learn more about Lewis and many other Native anthropologists in my book. See that little plug there? Florence and Lewis Shotridge were just two among untold numbers of Indian boarding school survivors. The enforced assimilation at these schools is best seen in the images shown here. On the left is an 1882 photograph of Dene Navajo community member Tom Torlino when he first arrived at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. The photo on the right was taken 3 years later, shortly before departing the school. These before and after photographs were used by Carlisle founder Richard Henry Pratt to show the supposed good work he and his staff were doing. In Pratt's infamous words, his goal for students like Tom Torlino was to, quote, kill the Indian in him and save the man. Pratt and other Indian boarding school staff sought to eradicate everything native about these students. They wanted them to assimilate to Euro-American Christian society and abandon their cultures. All of these students faced daily racism for being members of a supposedly lesser race. They were taught that their cultures were backward, their histories primitive, their languages barbaric, and their religions blasphemous. But in addition to the heart-rending racism and abuse these children endured, they also learned lessons from each other that their teachers did not anticipate. They learned their cultures were rich, their histories a source of pride, their languages beautiful, and their religions something to be honored, not discarded. Through the devastating experiences of their boarding school days, these Native women and men learned to speak, read, and write in English, making them ideal candidates to work in the new anthropological profession. With the photographs seen here, I challenged the before and after student photos made popular at the Carlisle Indian Boarding School. On the left is an image of Southern Arapaho anthropologist Cleaver Worden in his youth at Carlisle in 1884, appearing assimilated. However, in the middle photograph taken 14 years later, Worden has re-embraced his culture, largely rejecting the assimilationist teachings from boarding school. Here he is seen wearing clothing and holding items taken from his Southern Arapaho community. Personally, I found the juxtaposition of these two images so powerful that I chose them to be on the cover of my book, seen here on the right side of the screen. The contrast of young Cleaver Worden at Carlisle and older Cleaver Worden in Southern Arapaho dress perfectly illustrates how some Indian boarding school survivors re-embraced their cultures despite attempts to assimilate them. Clearly, this contrast of the before and after images of Cleaver Warden is the obverse of the more popular before and after student photos like those we just saw of Tom Torlino. These images of Warden's decision to return to his heritage after being forced to endure assimilation in his youth disrupts the supposed good assimilation work heavily promoted by Carlisle founder and staunch assimilation advocate Richard Henry Pratt. In this book, I highlight the lives of Cleaver Warden, Florence Shotridge, and 8 other Native individuals who were instrumental in the development of early U.S. anthropology. Sadly, all of them have largely been left out of the anthropological literature, if mentioned at all. Their names appear simply as footnotes. My goal with this book is to restore identity and humanity to 10 of these boarding school survivors who represented their indigenous communities in museum exhibitions, in publications, and on a variety of public stages. In greater or lesser degrees, each of them found ways to confront settler colonialism and undermine federal assimilation policies created to eliminate their ways of life. Fortunately for their communities and for us, these Indian boarding school survivors didn't succumb to the dominant rhetoric of racism and assimilation. Instead, they turned the power against a settler colonial world that used every weapon in its arsenal to erase their cultures. By turning the power, these Native individuals used their negative experiences in boarding schools to produce positive results. They chose not to discard their Native identities, cultures, communities, and languages as they had been taught to do. Instead, they embraced these things. While these Native anthropologists strove to present non-Native audiences with an accurate record of their people, they also worked for something more. They each sought to create a lifeline for future generations of their own communities, for future generations who hopefully wouldn't live in a world where their histories and cultures were constantly under attack. By retelling the life stories of these largely unrecognized Native anthropologists, we humanize them and acknowledge the work they did to preserve their cultures. It is only a little step, perhaps, but it is a step in the right direction. As far as conducting research, I scoured archives across the nation to piece together the lives of these Native anthropologists. Some of the many different archival sources I used included anthropological footnotes, diaries and journals, boarding school records, newspapers, Indian census rolls, state and federal census rolls. There's even more. See, this is the stuff that Brian and I both enjoy. Marriage licenses, correspondence, oral histories from family members, photographs, and government publications, among others. I also include here a list of the many repositories I visited in person and online to conduct this research. I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge my debt to Native scholar Dr. Clifford Trafser, professor of American Indian Affairs at UC Riverside, for introducing me to the phrase turning the power. As Dr. Trafser wrote in his book Boarding School Blues, Indian boarding school students use the potentially negative experience to produce a positive result: the preservation of Indian identity, cultures, communities, languages, and peoples. My book seeks to expand upon Dr. Trafser's initial work. Additionally, I couldn't have accomplished all of this without the help and encouragement of my wife, Leslie, and the many colleagues, friends, and family members who are too numerous to list here. Finally, I wanted to add some photos of our felines, Pierogi and Paprika. As I note in my book's dedication, since day one, they both kept me company, assuring me that the best seats in the house were somehow always on my keyboard and notes. There, I had to add a little joke there at the end. If interested, you're welcome to order your own copy of Turning the Power through the publisher's QR code on the screen. I know there are copies of my book at the entrance to this room. And now I want to thank everyone once again for their attention. If there are questions, criticisms, I'm happy to address them. Thank you.
So we have some time for Q&A. If you have a question, you can raise your hand and we'll get you a mic.
Thank you for that very interesting talk. Could you talk some more about the term anthropologist? That is usually thought of as somebody with academic credentials and a kind of distance on their subject. And I've not heard it before used to be applied to what perhaps may be self-taught anthropologists, but and how was that term used at the time that you're talking about in this particular case?
Thank you. That's a really, really good question. I didn't end up going into it in detail here in this presentation, but in my book, I make a fairly distinct difference between anthropologists and collaborators. And collaborator is a problematic term, admittedly, but it's one that I use to describe a lot of non-native anthropologists and the native collaborators that they worked with. But at the time many of these native collaborators and anthropologists were working, they would have been referred to as informants, which is also a problematic term. But I do want to make the distinction that not all anthropologists were non-native, primarily white men. There were native anthropologists who had those academic qualifications. One of them, who I talk about in my book, is William Jones, who's the first native person in the U.S. to get a PhD in anthropology. But there kind of was a distinction between not only the academic qualifications, but if you worked in a museum, you were considered an anthropologist, whether you're native or non-native. So people would have considered Florence Shotridge and definitely Lewis Shotridge to be an anthropologist. But other native collaborators who were working in the field didn't really get to use that title. I'm just using it myself because I think they were anthropologists in everything but name. I hope that answers. Good.
Sure.
Could you share some more information regarding the boarding schools and how they basically just, roped in all of these kids, and at what age, and how long a period did the boarding schools exist over, and where were they?
Those are good questions, which we could talk about for a long time. I'll try to summarize because it's a very broad question. Boarding schools specifically, where students lived and boarded, weren't that popular of a thing until the mid to late 1800s. The most common that we think of is the Carlisle Indian Boarding School that really started a trend, and it was founded in 1879. But native children were indoctrinated and taken from their homes voluntarily and involuntarily since there was a colonial European presence in North America. I believe at Dartmouth was the first education of native students in the 1700s, 1600s. I'm looking at Brian, but I don't know if he knows.
I think there's some at Harvard, maybe
Okay.
too.
But let's see how to answer your question. I do want to stress that in the initial days of Indian boarding schools, and those I'm kind of looking at Carlisle and Haskell and some of the bigger ones that people might be familiar with, initially, a lot of the students chose to go or their parents chose for them to go. But students rarely, the native family members, whether the children or the adults, had very little idea of what the children would be experiencing there, and clearly none of them knew that this would be forced eradication of their cultures and life ways. It wasn't until 1890s or so a little later after Carlisle was founded, that the federal government started withholding rations from native parents who wouldn't allow their children, who tried to keep their children away from boarding schools. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs had his agents not feed people, and they might starve on reservations if they didn't give up their children. So I guess I'm trying to show it's so broad, the different experiences, and across the entire nation, let alone residential schools in Canada. And these, like I said, had existed since colonial powers were here. I'm sorry? Yes, yes. It was the former Army barracks, and Richard Henry Pratt actually took several prisoners there first, native prisoners, and then later it became a boarding school.
I'd like to note one quick thing, then we'll go to there and then to here. On this topic, there's a really excellent organization called the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They have extremely excellent resources, also some pulled from archival collections, as well as new stuff they're doing with communities. It's a native-run organization, so I highly recommend that.
Yeah.
Also, for people in Philadelphia, there was a boarding school in Philadelphia, specifically called the Lincoln Institute at 11th and Spruce. It was in the 1890s. That was the girls' school. The boys' school was more of an industrial school. That was at 49th and Woodland. There was a good article on the hiddencity.org website about this a few years ago.
Thank you so much for mentioning that, Brian. Yeah, just to say that name again of the organization, it's the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. It's a mouthful, but it's a wonderful organization that tries to pull together a lot of Native stories and experiences and the archival materials that document those experiences. Just a quick plug, there also is going to be a boarding school symposium where I'll be speaking in New Jersey at Monmouth University, March 26th and 27th. So if people are interested, you can attend online. I believe registration's free, but don't quote me on that.
We have a question from online. Did you have an opportunity to connect with any of the relatives of the folk whose stories you discuss in your book?
Unfortunately, only one family, Amos One Road, who is another one of the anthropologists that I discuss. He was both an anthropologist who worked at the Museum of the American Indian, the American Museum of Natural History, and the Milwaukee Public Museum throughout his career, and then left all that behind him after about 10 years and became a Presbyterian missionary and pastor. So it's a really interesting clash between preserving his culture but also accepting or assimilating to some Christian culture. But that's beside the point. Yes, his grandchildren wrote about him and have talked about him a lot, so there's oral histories there. Thank you.
Just a little bit more about the Lincoln Institute.
Yeah.
It was founded by a woman named Mary McHenry Cox, who was a wealthy young woman who kind of threw herself into benevolent works. It started as a school for Civil War orphans, and when they kind of ran out of orphans, she wanted to keep it going, so they began recruiting, if you will, Native Americans. She then, for 1898, whenever the White City was, the exposition, the Columbian Exposition.
1893.
Well, she went on expedition there to a World Fair and in the same writing and to a Sioux reservation, didn't find anything irony in that. And she was appalled to find, for example, a student who had been in her school who'd been clean and Christian and whatever had, quote, reverted to savage ways.
Exactly,
yeah. So right here in Philadelphia, and there was a boys' school in West Philly.
Thank you for that.
Oh, thank you. Oh, sorry. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Any way you can clarify, like, how you came to this project? Like, was it something you found in the National Museum of the American Indian and as a reference archivist that kind of got you on this path, or
A little of both. I do very similar work as the reference archivist at the National Museum of the American Indian. Actually, somebody just asked about the Lincoln Institute the other day, about the boarding school here in Philadelphia. I was doing my dissertation, which is on the history of anthropology and the history of Native American representation in museums. And my dissertation was this, enormous, all-encompassing 450-page monster. But as I was doing the research for that, I was looking at all of these non-native anthropologists and the different institutions where they worked. And again, I kept coming up with these similar names of Lewis Shotridge and Florence Shotridge and Richard Davis. And all of these people were just included as footnotes. and I hadn't seen their names anywhere else in the anthropological literature. So after I finished my dissertation, I'm like, well, here's a much better story to tell. Here's at least 10. I mean, and there's, dozens of others that I didn't do research into, but I ended up focusing on 10 native anthropologists who have been kind of left out. So, of course, thank you.
Thank you. I came here with virtually zero knowledge of Indian boarding schools. I have heard, however, of Carlisle boarding school. So 2 questions. I think I know of it because a very famous athlete named Jim Thorpe went there.
Sure, yes.
And he was an Indian, right?
Yes, yes, he was.
Okay,
He was
and the
Sac
second
Fox.
question, does it still exist?
No, not as an Indian boarding school. It was closed. I'm looking again at Brian. I know Richard Henry Pratt left, was actually kicked out in the early 1900s. But regardless, no, the school itself no longer exists. I believe the U.S. Army has a museum there now, though importantly, Native children's remains, children who died at the Indian boarding school, are still buried there, and it's an ongoing situation trying to get their remains back home. But I will give a plug on a slightly lighter note that Jim Thorpe, the famous Carlisle athlete and Olympian, was a member of the Sac and Fox Nation. His daughter, Grace Thorpe, also ended up being a huge name in her own right, was also an Indian boarding school survivor, but then later became a World War II veteran and an activist, and all of her papers are at the National Museum of the American Indian in the archives, so if you're interested. Yep.
Well, I can think of a question while other people are
Sure.
working on it. This is not meant to be too archival geek question, but you showed us all the places you've done research at, and you just mentioned someone whose papers are there, but where you work. But with a lot of these, I'm assuming, a lot of these cases, I'll speak for the APS, there are some figures similar to this who very rarely does it say the so-and-so papers. It's often hidden within some other section of someone else's papers.
Yeah.
Like Ella Deloria is like that, George Hunt. There's some stuff in there's this Tohono O'odham linguist who's in John Alden Mason papers. Could you speak about how the different ways you've found more of these records, and any observations on why it's often hidden like that?
Yeah, unfortunately, it is difficult. I don't know how many people do this type of archival research, but when as I work with indigenous community members doing their family research all the time, unfortunately, photographs of their ancestors usually aren't going to be cataloged as their names. Their photographs will be cataloged under the anthropologist's name, because usually he was the one who took the photographs. So it ends up being really challenging to find these records, to find these materials, and that's my job to help people access their materials. But yeah, to refer back to the earlier question about how I kind of stumbled upon these 10 Native anthropologists, I don't think I ever would have if I hadn't have already been so far into my research for my dissertation, because you can't just hope that you'll find well, I take that back. There are the Lewis Shotridge papers at the Penn Museum archives, so that's one of the exceptions. But for most of these Native anthropologists and collaborators, you've really, really got to do some digging. But to anybody doing that type of research out there, I'd say it's people like Brian and I and another, a large network of other archivists at these types of institutions who help people and connect them to their family history. So that's, yeah.
We have another question from online.
Sure.
I've heard during the allotment era, Indian agents would grant a certificate of competency to any/only natives who consented to their children attending boarding school. Did you find any evidence of that?
I've heard the same thing. I never came across those certificates, but I will say kind of relatedly, forced allotment, if people aren't familiar, it's when the federal government would come in supposedly with native tribal participation, but the federal government would come in and say, this reservation can't be held by everybody anymore. We're going to divvy it up and everybody gets parcels of land. And the idea was that native peoples would become individual farmers. Anyway, that allotment ended up really letting in a lot of greedy people who took native land and who kind of swindled native peoples out of their territories. Why I'm mentioning that at all is just to say that a lot of the native anthropologists that I looked into, as they had been Indian boarding school students, they had been taught that assimilation and allotment was good, and they believed that and echoed those sentiments in their Indian boarding school days. Once they went back to their reservations and saw the damage that allotment and assimilation had caused on their reservations, that's when a lot of them chose to stop assimilating and to re-embrace their cultures. So, yeah, that doesn't exactly answer the online question. Sorry.
Well, that seems like a good stopping point. Certainly if you have more questions to think of, I'm sure Nate would be glad to chat with any folks here. Please get a book if you're interested. And to everyone online, thank you for joining us. And to all of you here, we hope to see you again next time.
Thank you so much.